of Vinita Bali. I'm very happy to welcome here. So we have a masterclass program this year, 2023, which builds on the masterclass program we had last year. We are offering one masterclass per month on the last Thursdays of every month between February and June. And we organize this masterclass as part of our UNESCO chair on education for sustainable development with the Earth Charter. And I'm happy to welcome you. We're actually organizing this UNESCO chair as a collaboration between the University for Peace and our Earth Charter Center for Education for Sustainable Development that is located here on the campus of the University for Peace in Costa Rica. I'm Miriam Vilela. I'm the Executive Director of Earth Charter International, and I will be your host for today's masterclass. So every masterclass, we envision this as a moment for us to engage in a conversation. First, to listen from a leader on a specific topic. We're going to spend some time hearing, having the pleasure of hearing Vinita Bali here, and then we are going to exchange some thoughts and Q&A and have some moment in a breakout room for you to dig a bit more. But this masterclass, our intention is to have a moment to talk about business leadership, but also the challenge of the current time. And we want to offer this as an opportunity for us to think about the kind of leadership that business all around the world must have or must take to interact in a more responsible manner. But given the fact that Vinita has such a vast experience in the world of corporate and private sector, we would like to hear from her examples of good practices and even challenges of leadership in companies in terms of decision making. So thank you so much, Vinita, for joining us today here. And I would like to start by inviting our friends here who are joining us to share with us what do you feel, or how do you feel when you are under the sun, or when you are under the stars? What's that feeling of being under the sun and the stars? And if you can write in the chat box and take the opportunity to introduce yourself with your name, the country where you are, but also this question of how do you feel when you are under the sun or under the stars? Peaceful, gratitude, and regenerated. Thank you, Alide. Much energy and bliss. Support, comfortable and happiness. Thank you, Vavili. Very humble. Thank you, Zoe. Yet empowered by the bigness and beauty. Chris, thank you, Chris. The sky reminds me of how small. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone. So let me introduce Vinita Bali. I think although Vinita is in India, we both share the same sun and the stars, and the feeling when we look at the moon and the stars, and just the feeling of having the sun and the wind going through our skin, independently of where we are in the culture where we grew up. So I have a very special connection with India, as many of you might know. I have worked for many years with several people from India, including through the drafting process of the Earth Charter, where we had a significant contribution from Kamala Chaudhry, among others, especially in that notion of inner peace and peace that is articulated in the Earth Charter. And over the past 30 years, we have had a lot of learning in conversations with people from India. But I thought Vinita Bali would bring something very interesting to our Earth Charter world because she comes from a corporate world, and we have much to learn, and we need to make a lot of bridges between the world of the Earth Charter that is around global ethics and cultivating, nurturing an ethic of care for one another in the large living world. So Vinita is the former CEO and managing director of Britannia Industry, which is an Indian company specialized in food industry. Prior to that, she spent most of her career serving in leadership roles across the world in major companies such as Cadbury, Schweppes, and Coca-Cola Company. Vinita currently serves on the board of director of many companies and holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Delhi in India, and she has a master of business administration from the Institute of Management Studies in India. So Vinita, thank you so much for being here and joining us today.
Thank you very much, Marian, and I'm grateful to you for giving me this opportunity. It would be great if we could make this session as interactive as possible. But what I've got is for us to just get started on context setting a little bit, and then for me to share my experience of what I have seen in my own executive journey, as well as what I am seeing as a non-executive director on the boards of companies, not just in India, but also in the USA as well as in Singapore. So we started off by, Marian, you started us off by talking about the sun and the stars. Well, I'm here to say that wherever you are, you're seeing the sun, and where I am, I'm actually seeing the moon and the stars. So I think between all of us, we're sort of covering our little planet. So I have a few slides, which I'm going to request, Marian, if you could just project those. Those are really as backgrounders to set context. And, once the slides are there, we can get started. Okay, so this is really just the topic of, what is the challenge of leadership, especially in business, given everything that we're talking about with respect to climate change and sustainability and so on. Next, please. So I've just put down what I see as key challenges right now confronting our world. There is the big challenge of inequity, whether it is economic inequity, gender inequity, geographic inequity. We're looking at environmental degradation all around us. The resource constraints are actually increasing, both as a result of the degradation of the environment, but also some of the recent events and the economic impact of those events. And last and most important is what we've all just lived through in the last 3 years, I would say, with the pandemic. The VUCA world, as the business likes to call it, which is a world which is volatile, a world which is uncertain, which has complexity and ambiguity all at once. And I think the best example I can think of a VUCA event is when the pandemic happened. As somebody said, we were all in the same storm, but we were not necessarily in the same boat. So different countries dealt with it differently. Within the same country, people had different experiences and so on. And what we have to realize is whether as customers or as civil society or as leadership in companies, academic institutions, not-for-government organizations, these are the challenges all of us have to work our way through. Next, please. I just put this, you don't have to look at the numbers. Basically, all this is really trying to say is that, these are the top 5 countries in the world. The total world GDP, if you look at 2023, is estimated at $106 trillion. But the fifth country, which happens to be India, is just $3.8 trillion compared with the US at $26 trillion. That point is brought home even further when you look at the GDP per capita, where in India, we are talking about a GDP per capita of about 2,700 US dollars, and the US is a GDP per capita of $78,000. I'm just looking at the numbers in 2023. Of course, we all know the China story and how China in the last 50 years or so has made progress, which is more significant than any other country in the world. And part of that is also what is at the center of some of the geopolitical reorganization or the geopolitical tensions that we are seeing. Of course, the billionaires have had a great time. From about 275 in 1991, we're really talking about $2,700 billionaires in the world. And as we all know, whether it is Thomas Piketty who said it or others, there is a fairly bipolar distribution in the world. Next, please. And that's really brought about, and what I said, our world is, it's beautiful, it's mysterious, but it's also very unequal. Where the richest 10% of the population of 8 billion people own 76 to 80% of the global wealth. And if we look at the net new wealth that was generated in the last 3 years, the richest 1% benefited to the extent of $42 trillion. That's nearly 2/3 of the new wealth that was generated. Of course, we're beginning to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion. And increasingly, certainly in the business world, as also in some other organizations, it is increasingly forefronted. But there's a lot of distance yet to travel on this. Talking about the business world, if you look at the Fortune 500 companies in the US, and you say, how many of those are led by CEOs who happen to be women? The number is just about 10%. Right now, it's 53 out of 500. And if I look at the FTSE 100, it's only 8%. So there are only 8 companies out of FTSE 100 that have a woman CEO. And here we are talking about the business world. When we go into some of the other domains, the numbers look even more skewed. So there is, I think, recognizing where we are in the world which all of us inhabit, I think is the first step to saying, what are the measures we need to change it? Next, please. Here's another way of looking at inequity. We're talking about just the basics of food. I'm not even talking about shelter. World hunger and malnutrition is at an all-time high, at a time where, the GDP of this world is about $106 trillion. Out of 8 billion people, nearly 2.5 billion are either moderately or severely food insecure. There are 900,000 people that are in famine conditions. The gender gap, as far as food security is concerned, is skewed not in favor of women and children. The number of children under the age of 5 that are stunted in the world continues to be order of magnitude in double digits. So we are talking about a world that is unequal in terms of its economic prowess, a world that is unequal in terms of its social status, and therefore also a world that is fairly unequal in terms of the impact of environmental conditions on people who are living in this world. Next, please. Of course, we in geological terms, this is the age of the Anthropocene, where, there are estimates that by 2050, if we don't change things, There could be more plastic in our oceans than fish. We, as a society around the world, cut 15 billion trees a year. The devastation in the Amazon in the last few years is something that all of us have seen and read about. The Arctic summer ice is reducing. In other words, I'm not sharing anything new with you. I've just put it as a context to lead on to, therefore, what is the action all of us need to take as individuals, and more importantly, companies and leadership of business needs to take if we are to save the one planet that we know and the one planet that we inhabit. Next, please. So the world is, despite the $106 trillion, if you look at the value of stock markets around the world, that's another over $100 trillion. But despite that, we are entering a phase of constraints as far as key resources are concerned. Those key resources are capital. For the first time in geographies like North America and Western Europe, we are seeing both high inflation and very high interest rates. There was a time when we all remember there was zero interest rate in the US, and it was a great time for PE firms, for entrepreneurs to get into business because the cost of capital was virtually nothing. Today, with interest rates at 6 and 7 and 8%, and if you are in a country like mine, which is India, you could be paying interest rates in double digits, 11 and 12%. Suddenly, capital has become more expensive. Despite the 8 billion people, despite the high unemployment we see in so many countries, there is a labor shortage for right skills. So one of the boards that I sit on is a technology company called Cognizant, which is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And right now, the entire IT world is scrambling to get the right kind of computer scientists who know AI, who know big data, who can actually write some of these new codes. So there are many IT people available, but the IT people with the right skills, cybersecurity is another huge threat for companies. We all read, how Target was attacked. One of the companies that I'm on the board of, we were subject to a ransomware attack. And I can tell you that is a very frightening situation to be in, because the ransomware people are on your IT system. They've got a virus on the IT system, and then they're negotiating with you on, what needs to be paid, what needs to be done for them to restore the IT system back to you. We all remember a time when LaGuardia had to be shut down because they foresaw a potential interference, with the IT system at the airport. So, all of this is happening around us. It's not some sci-fi that we see on celluloid, and our real world is not impacted by that. Take water. There are places in India where women have to walk several kilometers only to get, 2 buckets of water. So all of this is real, and through this, all of us as individuals and businesses have to navigate our way. Next, please. So the VUCA world, what do I mean by that? I've already talked about the pandemic, cybersecurity, geopolitical alliances. Who thought that Russia would go to war with Ukraine, and the world would, whether they liked it or not, countries would have to posture and, sort of support, but not support. And, that is something that we are all living through. And uncertainty like that also causes great uncertainty in supply chains, in inflationary indexes. And again, all of us as consumers and customers, as well as in business, have to navigate our way through all of this happening simultaneously. Next, please. So another way of thinking about it is really to say that the problem has been caused by us, humans. You know, I once read a Greenpeace little line which said that the world was created 4.6 billion years ago, but if we took it down to 46 years, then humans first walked on this planet 4 years ago. The Industrial Revolution happened a minute ago, and between then and now, we've destroyed half of the world's forests. And that's what we are seeing. The reason why I'm talking about this is because it's not happening to somebody else. It's happening to all of us, whether we are in business, whether we are employees, you know, our relatives, our friends. You know, when there is extreme rainfall, and again, I speak of my country, India, which is, you know, still 65% of people are employed in agriculture. We depend on rainfall, or the monsoons, as we call it in India. And if there is a failed monsoon, there is a failed agricultural crop, and that impacts everybody else. So if you're a food company, you know, like I worked in a food company, Britannia, we used to make bakery as well as dairy products. You know, suddenly in a year where you didn't have a good monsoon, prices would shoot up, and that impacts everybody, you know, from your consumer to your vendor to your customers to everybody else. You know, David Attenborough at the age of 94 is still talking to us and telling us that we can still save this world if we were to change our habits. And that, I believe, is the leadership challenge, not just in the business world, but in every world. Next, please. So this is a wonderful proverb which I came through, which is Sri India proverb. It says, you know, when the last tree has died, when the river has been poisoned, and there are no fish to catch, we will realize that we cannot eat money. And I must say, the business world has to take responsibility for putting profit above everything else. That's the way business leaders are rewarded. That's the way business is done. And you know, in recent times, look at some of the other things that we have been a witness to. An iconic brand like Volkswagen creates cars that are smart enough to emit a different emission profile just to pass the US emission test. It took 2 crashes of, you know, the Boeing Max for the company to actually wake up and say, we have an issue in our safety systems. Now, unless we as consumers and customers call out those challenges for business, things are not going to change. But I do want to create a sense of optimism and hope, because there are changes that are taking place in the business world. And I think we will begin to see those changes accelerating and not decelerating. Next, please. You know, again, the question that is raised in the business world is, you know, what is sustainable growth? In the 70s, business described it as, you know, repeatable and ethical performance. As long as a company was generating enough returns to keep itself afloat and make sure that it was generating enough profit to service its cost of debt, that was considered to be a sustainable business. And, you know, Milton Friedman, the wonderful economist, is quoted oftentimes for saying the business of business is business. In other words, you know, business doesn't really have to worry about the planet and the fish and the oceans and the whatever. As long as business is generating money, we are just fine. 20 years ago, the whole concept of the triple bottom line emerged, which for the first time talked about profit, people, and planet. Today, you know, there is a lot that is being said about corporate social responsibility, SRI, which is, you know, socially responsible investments, the 17 SDGs that 193 countries signed up for in 2015, which directly impact some businesses, you know, ESG, which increasingly is becoming a framework, not just for governance, but also for environment and and social equity together with sustainability. So there is a lot that is happening, very fast, which is also causing the metrics by which you judge a business to be reviewed, to be questioned, to be challenged in terms of, are these the right metrics by which we are measuring that which we do? Next, please. So there are some notable shifts. Norges Bank, which is the central bank of Norway, several years ago, over a decade ago, was very vocal in terms of divesting positions in industries that were not environmentally responsible, so coal and oil. Today, if you go to the website of Norges Bank, they've actually listed out hundreds of companies which have been listed into which the bank will make no investments. They were followed by the biggest pension system in the world, the General Pension Investment Fund in Japan, which has 1.4 trillion of assets under management. And these funds speak with money. These funds speak with the fact that if the business is not environmentally conscious, socially equitable, and economically responsible, then no investment goes into businesses of that nature. And they are transparent and candid enough to actually list those businesses on their website. So I firmly believe that market forces, which is eventually what capitalism really understands, will propel the switch from fossil fuels to renewables as the economics for the renewables change. And actually in 2021, for the first time, green energy became less expensive than fossil fuels in some countries. And there are examples again from India where a very large commitment has been made to solar power, because we're a country where 350 days of the year, the sun rises and can generate a lot of solar power. So a lot of investment is being made there, not nearly enough for the destruction that has been caused already. But I think the pace is accelerating, and therein lies the good news. Next, please. So, I'm stating the obvious. Business is at the intersection of society and the environment. Business is impacted positively or negatively by what is happening in the environment. There is a systemic risk of climate change. There is pressure from stakeholders. So it is the wealthy who who put their money into investment funds, which in turn invest in companies, are asking questions of their wealth managers in terms of where that money is being invested, and actually stating that unless that money is invested in companies which have a good track record of sustainability or ESG practices, that money will not be available. So to some extent, the capital constraint that I talked about earlier is also being caused by the additional standards to which companies are being held accountable. Industry always looks at opportunity. There is an opportunity, and radical shifts are taking place, whether it is transportation or the food industry. I mean, the launch of Tesla was also a VUCA event because it just shook up the automobile industry. It wasn't a Toyota or a Volkswagen that said, in order to protect our environment, let's look at electronic vehicles. It took an upstart like a Tesla to shake up that world. And now, as we all know, every significant car manufacturer is looking at EVs and moving away from cars that require fossil fuels. Next, please. So, short point, exogenous variables will really create that momentum. The only one other thing I want to mention on this slide, or two things, is the big influence that millennials and Gen Z is having on decisions that business is taking from 2 points of view. Millennials and Gen Zs as prospective employees and how they are choosing to determine which companies to join and which not to join. The second is millennials and Gen Z consumers as potential consumers and customers who are willing to pay more to buy products that are environmentally and socially responsible and not anything that is placed before them. And that's a very big force because in every country in the world, it is the same awakening within that group. The last point is on transparency and reporting. And several countries, in fact, almost all countries have made it mandatory for every listed company to report on what is happening in E, what is happening in S, what is happening in G. And, that is creating a lot of new frameworks, like we've got auditing and accounting standards that are standardized across the world, something like the TCFD, which is the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, or the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, is actually creating those standards against which companies will have to start reporting. Next, please. So, to some extent, the goal is clear. I think most companies have recognized that there is no turning back. The goal is clear. The plan is still being worked through. And, those determinants are, where should each company focus for greater impact? Because every company can't do everything. Companies have to really go back and say, where is the maximum carbon footprint and where is the maximum action that can be taken? That also requires some guts. It definitely requires resources, and it definitely calls for a period in time when the financial metrics may not look as good as the financial metrics have looked in the past. And to some extent, the investment bankers and the investment industry will also have to relook at the metrics that reward performance or not. There have been, we talked about serious governance lapses. I shared the example of Volkswagen and Boeing, but recently there was an IPO of WeWorks that had to be pulled off at the last minute because certainly on governance criteria, the investment bank that was advising WeWorks talked about a valuation that nobody was willing to invest in. And from a $50 billion value, it came down to less than $5 billion. Now, that's a serious governance lapse as well. And I think those are the things that are increasingly being called out by regulators and others. Next, please. Miriam, I just want to check how we are doing on time. I will accordingly pace.
Yeah, go ahead. You can
another 10 minutes?
Go for another 10 minutes, yes.
Okay. All right. I'll just keep a watch on time. So the board's role, in addition to the executive role, has to be very significant because at the end of the day, in listed companies at least, the boards are responsible for ensuring that the executives meet those standards. And the board, therefore, has to ask the tough questions, which I have listed here. Next, please. The conversations around ESG and greenwashing have both grown. A lot of companies have made commitments on net zero, but when you work through the detail, I could achieve net zero by not reducing my own carbon footprint, but going out, if I am a company with rich resources, and buying carbon credits and saying, well, I am net zero. I, as a company, may be net zero, but our planet is not really net zero. So I think unless there is a systemic effort at every company reducing its carbon footprint. Every individual, we as individuals have a role to play in this. Every individual reducing his or her carbon footprint, this thing is not going to change. You know, all the COP26 commitments of, 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, etc., actually call for the carbon footprint to virtually be halved on a per capita basis. And, companies have to play a role, business has to play a role, regulators have to play a role, and individuals have to play a role. Next, please. So, why is business leadership critical? I'm stating the obvious. Business is part of the ecosystem. It uses a very high and sometimes proportionate resources of the planet. And therefore, sustainable practices, unless they are at the core of the business model, businesses can't say, this is what I do, which is I end up polluting the environment in the business I do. But by the way, this is my CSR activity. Very often I use an example in India where, several of our rivers get polluted by industrial effluent that is just pushed into the river. And when CSR became mandatory in India, a lot of the companies took on as a CSR, cleaning of the rivers. And I remember writing at that time that this doesn't make any sense. First, I pollute the river, and then I spend my CSR money in cleaning the very river that I have polluted. So the action has to happen, the action has to happen, not just in terms of cleaning the rivers, but in not polluting the river to begin with. And therefore, business practices, business models have to change. What is the energy that we're using? Where is the fuel efficient energy? Is packaging material getting more and more biodegradable, etc., etc. And there are some examples which I want to share with you of companies that are already on that path and actually doing some very good cutting edge work in the area. Next, please. So, Patagonia is an example that comes up, very often. But the reason why I want to share this as an example of a responsible business is from the day the company was formed, Patagonia made a commitment that 1% of its net revenue, not 1% of its profit, 1% of its net revenue would be put into initiatives that actually make our planet more healthy. They've made a commitment to be completely carbon neutral by 2025. In fact, the most recent initiative they have taken is to convert it from a business entity into a trust, which means all of the profit that Patagonia earns is going to go back into the environment. It is the first company I have known that actually has advertised to say that if you have a Patagonia jacket, don't buy a new one till you've come to us and we tell you whether your existing jacket can be repaired or not repaired. Now, if you think about it, this is the very antithesis of business, because business is all about finding ways and means to getting you to buy more. And here is a business that is saying, please don't buy more. See what we can do with the jacket you have before you decide to buy a new jacket. Tentree is another wonderful example of an apparel company. And again, if you look at their website, they put very, very clearly, they're the ones who created this blockchain, which has complete traceability to organic cotton and so on and so forth. But from the day Tentree was created, they made a commitment that anytime any of us buys even one apparel from them, they go and plant 10 trees. So again, this is not discretionary. It's not as though a new CEO can come and say, we are changing this. This is very much embedded into their numbers and into their business model. Next, please. Again, Tablas Greek is a vineyard, which, from the get-go, started with 100% solar energy, 100% organic practices. It is the first, actually not just in the USA, but in the world, regenerative, organically certified wine. Grove is another plastic neutral retailer that has made a commitment to clear from the ocean the same quantity of plastic that it uses. Now, these may not seem as though a lot is happening, but actually when you think about what it takes for a business to actually make this commitment and stay to this commitment, there is a lot that is happening. And, the other thing which is fascinating when one looks at this is how a large number of small companies are becoming the challenger to the big companies, where the big companies have no option but to fall in line. Next, please. And I'm going to close. This is an example from a company I worked with. I can talk some more about it if anybody is interested. But our insight really was that in a country like India, where you've got very high proportion of malnourished and undernourished children and women especially, and where micronutrient deficiencies are pervasive, we first started a CSR program that took the recipe of our biscuits and fortified it with vitamins and minerals, which we distributed as part of a midday meal to 120 million children in schools, which is where the meal goes. We then embedded it in terms of redoing the formulations into the commercial products that we sell. And that created a competitive edge for us, and a lot of other manufacturers in the industry followed. So this goes back to the example I had talked about earlier, which is that even within the business model and the business system, it is possible to look at green practices, environmentally sustainable and socially responsible practices. Next, please. So the role of leadership anywhere, and especially in business, is really to understand context. In this case, we've talked a lot about context. It's about accepting responsibility from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. It is to participate actively and not to be a bystander. And more importantly, it is about fostering a collaborative mindset and aligned action that will make the big difference as we move forward. Next, please. This we've talked about, so I won't spend any more time on this. I'm just going to end with a summary slide. If we could go to that, please, Miriam. So in summary, all I really want to say is that business is an influential part of the economic, of our ecosystem. Business decisions can either stress our planet or regenerate our planet. And right now, there is a momentum. There are exogenous influences for business to think more regeneratively than stressfully. Leadership calls for an inclusive dialogue and a multi-sectoral consensus, because this is not just what business does. It also has to do with the regulatory framework. It also has to do with the reward mechanisms. It has to do with how companies are judged and their performance calibrated against each other. But most importantly, it really calls for leadership competencies that are perhaps different from a mindset which said that business is all about generating profit and capitalism is all about directing capital to wherever it makes maximum returns. These leadership competencies really talk about empathy, not just towards people, but also towards the environment. They talk about a mindset which is principle-based and which is inclusive, whether we are talking about gender or geographic disparity or any other kind of inequity. Thank you very much. I know I've overshot our time, but I hope this has been useful.
Thank you so much, Vinita. It's good to hear you. It's for us, at least for me, it's good to hear the voice of someone who really works in the field of business and have seen this shift happening. we are going to have a short Q&A here, then we're going to break out rooms to have more chance to chat and then come back to plenary. But before that, I wanted to ask you to share with us. So I was very, very happy to hear you emphasize the role of the new generation of millennials and Generation Z, the important role as consumers, but also as employers. And what have you seen in the board discussions of how to address that in terms of adjusting, adapting to what the new generation or the market forces in the new generation is requiring, adapting it from the employer point of view, but also the seller?
Yeah, great question, Miriam. And as you can imagine with everything else, it's a wide spectrum. You know, there are the more enlightened businesses and the more enlightened boards that started these conversations early on. And if you pick up the annual reports of, certainly listed companies, it's very evident and very obvious. Those that started talking about sustainability, triple bottom line, value-added practices, etc., a long time ago, and created their own metrics by which these could be judged. There are others, I talked about greenwashing. So the spectrum goes all the way from those who understand it, have conviction around it, believe in it, have seen the forces coming, and therefore are very serious. So what do I mean by that? There are boards that are actually bringing on board individuals with very specific environment or CSR related or ESG experience, people who understand the domain, like boards have people who understand the domain of finance or marketing, because this is also special knowledge. This appears on the board agenda in every board meeting. In very many countries, it has now been mandatory to report against E, S, as well as G, your environmental practices, your social practices, and your governance framework. In social practices, for example, a metric that has been created, which works around the world, is to say, what is the CEO compensation compared with the median compensation of all the employees? And that increasingly, certainly the millennials and Gen Z are watching. If you watch the news this morning, certainly there was a report that Howard Schultz, who founded Starbucks, is sitting in Washington trying to defend decisions that were taken around employees creating unions or not creating unions. Amazon has been in this very big battle around unions, etc. So has Walmart. And these are questions that the boards are asking. These are questions, the difficult questions that the boards are asking to the executives. And as I said, I wish I could say that 70% of the companies are already in that bucket of, I'm convinced, I know what to do, I'm doing it, and here's the measure. We don't have the numbers. There is certainly a lot of talk. There is a lot more talk. There are a lot more commitments. Net zero, carbon neutral, all of these are commitments. And I do believe that, when there is so much of pervasive dialogue, there has to be action. There can't be no action.
Thank you. Just a comment on the ESG and corporate social responsibility. Of course, ESG is a buzzword now in term, but before that, and I still think nowadays, corporate social responsibility was something broader, I guess, as long as the company would actually put CSR or embed it in the DNA of the company in terms of its ethical responsibility with the common good, rather than just something outside. But the point that I wanted to highlight is when I see decisions such as the European Union making mandatory for European companies to issue their corporate social responsibility reporting in a broader sense. I don't think they are now mandatory to do it in the ESG framework, but more in the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, which is broader. I can see how this generates a domino effect in the supply chain. Have you seen, because I mean, many countries in the world, we trade and business with European Union for products in many ways. Have you seen a specific impact of companies in India, for instance, that are part of a supply chain to a company in Europe that has to adapt whatever they do in terms of their environment and social impact because of that mandatory thing that's going on now in terms of reporting in Europe, sustainability reporting in the European Union?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There is, a domino effect for sure. So I can talk with knowledge about the food industry. So, for example, there are large, large companies around the world based in the European Union, Louis Dreyfus, etc., ADM, Cargill, etc., that are buying some commodities from India. And part of that requirement, let's say coffee beans, part of that requirement is to actually get a certification that the vendor in India who is supplying the coffee beans to me, if I happen to be one of those commodity countries, is meeting the standards set by either the Rainforest Alliance or other standards. And there is a certification involved. So I, as a coffee farmer, if my practices are not in line with the sustainable practices that have been specified by the European Union or the Rainforest Alliance, I cannot sell my coffee for export. So certainly in the food industry, or you take, we used to buy a lot of palm oil from Indonesia. So Unilever actually started that, which is really to say, buy palm oil from those regions which have not been destroyed, where the orangutans have no place to go and so on. So it actually curtailed the supply chain because it bought from farms that actually could certify themselves in terms of responsible practices. So there is definitely a domino effect. There is definitely that effect on the entire supply chain because, as companies are also looking at carbon emissions, which are, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, everybody's scrambling around to see how best to be able to capture that information because, somebody's scope 3 is someone else's scope 1.
May I invite one more comment or question from Chris? Chris, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Marian, and thank you, Vinita. I enjoyed the presentation. I share your optimism and hope that we're going to get through this, that we're going to survive and be proud of what we've done. But I also have my concerns. You've mentioned some of the risks of sustainability, and I'm going to put something in the chat real quick. Everyone may or may not be familiar with the term stranded assets. And what that refers to is that we have an infrastructure of fossil fuels. We have refineries and ships and oil wells that if tomorrow we magically switch to renewable energy and no longer needed them, we have between 1.4 and 2.3 trillion dollars of assets that we don't need and can't use. And that might not sound like a problem. That might sound like ExxonMobil's problem and not ours. The problem is that they are smart, but greedy capitalists. So what they do, I can't afford to buy a house. I have to go borrow money to buy a house. ExxonMobil can't afford to build a refinery, but they choose to go to my bank and borrow money and pay them interest, because instead of spending $1 billion on a refinery, they're spending $1 million a month, and they could take that billion and give it to their wealthy shareholders and make them even wealthier. So they're very businesslike. They preserve their capital by letting the bank take the risk. So the concern is between now and 2050, or whenever we become nearly independent of fossil fuels, which I hope it's sooner than that, this is a big risk, not just for ExxonMobil and Chevron and British Petroleum. Every one of us on this call has a bank account, and there's a risk of what do we do with these assets? And we can't sell them, so banks are going to want money, and they're not going to be able to come up with it. So I'm just curious, how do we prepare for that, and how do we, that's obviously got to be a resistance that if you tell me that I'm going to have to throw my home away, I don't want to do that. I need to live in my home, and I have money invested in my home. So how do we convince big businesses and business leaders that you're going to have to do something with those stranded assets? How do we get them to do that, and how do we do that in a way that we don't collapse the entire global system in the process?
You know, it's a very big question. It's a very relevant question. If I had an answer to this, I would probably be doing something else. But I don't. I think, you know, like you raised this, there are, you know, several of these big elephants sitting around us. And, you know, part of it also has to do with, you know, where are the resources going to be generated? Now, you know, if you think about it differently, you know, $1.4 to $2.3 trillion sounds like a lot of money, but in the context of, you know, $100 trillion GDP around the world, it is manageable. You know, I would say that this is akin to what the banks have gone through in terms of non-performing assets. And what do the banks do over a period of time? You know, something happens, and, you know, these assets are written off against certain other assets. I think this, as I said, I wish I had an answer, but the answer probably lies in at least 3 or 4 different facets. You know, one of which was, and they didn't get very far with that in the last COP meeting in Egypt, which was a commitment really to say, how do some of the rich countries that have used a disproportionate high amount of the planet's resources fund some of the countries that need to be funded because they don't have the resources deployed. You know, this can only happen by, I think, pressure coming from the investment folks, the wealth managers, the stock market, the countries. Firstly, recognizing the problem, and secondly, recognizing that the solution has to come from the problem. You know, in many ways, Exxon and Shell and BP, etc., I personally don't think will be allowed, and I don't know how, to wash their hands away from all of this and say, you know what, it's not our problem. They will have to be part of the solution, but obviously they can't be the full solution.
Okay, thank you. There are a lot of food for thought here. Again, I also liked what you said in your presentation of the divest movement of even the banks and etc. So we are going to go to invite everyone to go and have a little chat with those who are here in the small groups. And the question is, what is your takeaway, your key learnings from this presentation, what we have heard from Vinita? What are the key competencies you think a business leader must have nowadays? Because we work in education, right? And we want to envision young leaders that are ethical, young leaders that are about to take on positions in various different sectors, not only in companies in the private sector, but also in the public sector. So what are the key competencies you think a business leader must have nowadays, so that we can see how we can cultivate that through our universities, or in a formal or non-formal education settings? Even I think when I envision companies, I hope many companies are working in professional development for their young officials and employees. So what are those key competencies that you think a business leader must have nowadays, considering the current times and the challenges we have? And again, your takeaways, the current the takeaways from this presentation, the competencies, and what is how do you see the role of an ethical instrument such as the Earth Charter in decision-making of the leadership in the private sector, considering our current time? So we'll come back here in about. So thank you, everyone. And we are back here. I'm starting with 2 questions I've received here for Vinita. And then I'm gonna call on you from each group to share your comments or your questions. So the first one is, if Vinita, if you can share with us an example of a specific situation you lived in your positions in Britannia or any other board, that you could see, oh, I can see here the change in the expanded role of business.
Yeah, I think, the example that I very quickly shared of what we did in Britannia, we didn't have to do it. There was no compulsion at all. It actually came from, if I can relate it to you as a story, it came from a very simple thing that Britannia was one of the impaneled suppliers to the World Food Programme for making its highly nutrition dense and calorie dense biscuits, which is the first packet of food that is dropped whenever there is a natural calamity like an earthquake or a tsunami or whatever. And I remember I had just got back to India after having worked overseas for many years, and I was walking through the factory, and that's what the factory manager said. And, somewhere we kind of stashed it at the back of our heads. And then there was the National Family and Health Survey, which, came and looked at India and the very poor nutritional status of children in schools and so on. And we kind of connected the two, and we said, if we're making these calorie and nutrition dense biscuits for WFP, surely there is something that we can do for people in India. That's how the question started. We then actually contacted a very large NGO that used to make meals and supply 150,000 meals to schools in a city in India, in Hyderabad. We worked with GAIN, which is the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. So it was a wonderful partnership. Britannia developed the recipe, worked with GAIN because of the experience that GAIN had had. Our other partner was the Nandi Foundation. And what we did was that in addition to the midday meal, we worked with, pediatricians and community health doctors at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, one of the most revered institutes, because we wanted to actually document everything. We developed this biscuit. We did randomized control trials with children. And to cut a long story short, what started off as just a little experiment, got into a big thing. And just to give you an idea, we did anthropometric measures of these kids before we started, and that is their height, weight, etc., to look at stunting, wasting. And we also did a very simple blood test that tells you the hemoglobin level, and the average in these schools was 8.5. Now, people like us would be admitted into a hospital and being given blood transfusion if we were 8.5, and there were these kids who were coming into these government schools, poor parents, etc. So we worked with a pediatrician who said, how much iron these kids need, etc., etc. After 100 days of this experiment, and we repeated it many times, and the results were the same, that 8.5 goes up to about 11.5. And there are other indicators like the child misses school less often, they're more healthy, they fall sick less often, etc., etc. Now, there was a cost to this. So when I went back to the board and I said, this is what we've done. And by the way, iron deficiency anemia is so pervasive in India that if we were to extend it to the products that we are making commercially, this is what the cost would be. And, at that time, there were no standards for food fortified products in India. So we took the UN standards, we adopted the Codex standards, and we gave ourselves a challenge, which is to say that through our cost effectiveness and efficiency programs, we will find the money to support the incremental cost of making fortified biscuits without increasing the price to the consumer. And we did it.
Yeah, that's a very concrete example you shared with Britannia, and it's something that we don't see actually from outside the outside world, the role of this shift in decisions. And how about your own experience? If you live in this many decision-making positions that you have had, if you had a specific incident or a situation that represented to you a significant dilemma and that required a particular leadership competence of you, and if you can share with us what was that and what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah, it happened very recently with the pandemic when, things were shut down, business for everybody was impacted, whether you were, whether you were selling food products or household items or refrigerators or service or travel or anything else. So I'm very proud to say that, I sit on 4 boards and, at that time I was on 3 boards. One of the decisions that was taken was that at a time like this, we are not going to lay off people. And certainly not lay anybody off at, at the junior levels, at the staff level, etc. And companies, the board, and senior executives took a decision that if we need to cut some expenses, it would start with, so the board took a cut in its fees. The CEO and the executive leadership took a reduction in what they were getting, but we took, literally it was a pledge to say that we're not going to let people go during the pandemic.
Good, thank you. It required also good sensitive, it makes good sense, no? For them.
Yeah, it absolutely makes good sense because, what you end up doing is you end up buying the goodwill of so many people who say, at a difficult time, this company helped me put food on the table. Mm. And we are talking about, junior staff, etc., which is why it always baffles me that right now we are seeing it. And, it drives me personally crazy. But every time a company announces a cut in people, the stock price goes up. Yeah. I mean, and you say, what is the stock market seeing? Right now we are seeing cuts in a lot of IT companies. And why should the stock go up when I'm laying off people? I find it very tough to understand. Those people didn't employ themselves in the company. The company went and found them and employed them. So I think these are some of the things where increasingly companies have to be held more accountable, and they will be. I think those are going to be the tough things that will happen.
Thank you. Let me open the floor. If anyone would like to make a comment or a question to Vinita, just raise your hand. or anything, any insight you have had from your conversation with others. Alida, I see your mic is open, so maybe you want go ahead, Alida.
Yes. Thank you, Vinita. It was really great to listen to your great experiences. I thought this last question was really important about dilemmas, and then you share a very positive example that you support, the one in Corona time to protect the workers and the people. But have you been in, maybe if there, it would be also good to know how you deal with a dilemma in case you really have to fight for something that is not shared by the others. And then how do you deal with that? That maybe that's more difficult to then sustain, and how do you do that? Or is it so inspiring that everybody feels the same way? I was wondering.
I can tell you that even the example that I shared, I made it sound like it was an easy decision, but there's a diversity of views on the table, which says that at the end of the day we are responsible to our shareholders and so on, and there are several of us who say that it's not shareholders any longer, it's actually stakeholders. And so it does take a long time to actually build this consensus. I have not been on boards like, for example, the example that I shared with Volkswagen. I've personally never been on a board, and I don't believe, I can't say for a fact, I don't believe that that is something that would have come to the board and the board would have decided. So I think in our executive lives, there are different dilemmas, and as a board, there is a different dilemma. I mean, I can tell you another example from my executive life, but which for me was a pretty straightforward decision, but some others may have looked at it a little bit differently. We were in the process of setting up new greenfield operations, in India. And there was a particular place where we wanted to put up a factory because economically it would have been more, it would have been better for us. But, the papers involved were not in order, and, there was a way of getting around it. Let me put it this way. There was a way of getting around it. And, we looked at it, we decided that, from a governance point of view, this absolutely makes no sense. Now, I can tell you, having operated in India, having operated in Africa, Latin America, etc., sometimes these are not black and white, these are shades of gray. So you can interpret it any which way. Talk about the Volkswagen's emission records. I was just reading the other day, I think in Fortune or somewhere, that till now, Volkswagen has paid fines of $33 billion for these emission records. The banks are forever paying a fine for, jigging the LIBOR rate and stuff like that. You look at the opioid crisis in the US, starting with Purdue Pharma to so many other companies, there is a fine you pay and you are neither guilty nor are you not guilty, and you get away with it. Personally, if you ask me, I've never been on a board or in a company in that situation, but I would find it very hard to be supportive of that. In matters of governance, there can't be shades of gray. To some extent, if there is an interpretation and nobody is being harmed, is another matter. But, there are certain things that you can create very fancy legal systems to get around it. But I think at the end of the day, I think leadership really calls for addressing moral and ethical issues, which go beyond business and numbers. And I think we really need to see more and more business leaders demonstrating that.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a good way to say, okay, thank you so much, Vinita and Alide. Anyone else would like to make a comment? Okay, Jane?
Thank you. Thank you, Vinita. I am really, really enjoying, I enjoyed your presentation. And I think it's very relevant, especially those in the business world today. My question is, the millennials and the Gen Zs tend to be the CEOs now in this time, and we are seeing more and more of them. And because they are more conscious of the social and environmental issues, then it becomes easier to really bring in the subject of how do we as an organization make sure that we embed all these practices in our organizations. But you find that the shareholders, and I'm not talking stakeholders now, I know now you should move from shareholders to stakeholders, but the reality is you have the shareholders and the board who are a little in the older generation and whose mind has not yet shifted into consciousness. And so what do you see as the role of the CEO in actually driving this change? And of course, to Miriam now, on the training done by the Earth Charter, to what extent is it really addressing this problem at the higher level of the shareholder and the boards? I just want to see how you see it, Vinita, the role of the CEO
No, the
in driving
CEO
that
actually,
change.
yeah, the CEO has, the dominant role to play because a lot of the direction, a lot of the culture, etc., comes from the CEO. And I think there are two kinds of CEOs. There are professional CEOs, people like me. I wasn't a founder. I didn't found any of the companies I worked with. I went in there as a professional. But I think what you're alluding to when you talked about millennials and Gen Z are people who actually create their own businesses. A lot of the examples that we were talking about are businesses. A lot of the disruptors are really more millennials than Gen Zs because, Gen Zs are hardly about 26, 27 years old now, and some of them in all parts of the world, whether it is Africa or India or Europe or the US, have created new business models, whether these are to do with personal care products or food items or whatever. So I think there is a difference, when you are a founder CEO, then you're also assembling your board. And I've seen that a lot of the founder CEOs assemble boards that are of like-minded people who are actually going to be supportive. I think it is the professional boards, take companies that have been around for a long time, and they're actually driving this change is harder because there is a culture which is already set. People are steeped in a particular way of working, and suddenly governance or environmental or social requirements are making new demands on them. In my experience, those are the companies that have more of a struggle than less. I also think, as we talked about earlier, there is a spectrum. There are some who still think that it's a tick in the box. We'll buy carbon credits. We'll, talk about zero whatever, and our job is done. But I think, like with everything else in life, there are authentic companies and then there are not such authentic companies. And I think over a period of time, the market will separate the winners from the losers, because when millennials, Gen Z, etc., vote with their money as consumers and decide which products they are going to buy, I think the response to the companies will also become very clear in terms of what are the priorities that their consumers are looking at, which are different from, what the older companies have done. But I'll tell you, large companies like the Coca-Cola company I worked with, and this is a question we asked long time ago, and we got down to working around it, which really was how many liters of water does it take to make a liter of Coke? And if you know that, then whether it's a Coke or a Pepsi, Several of them got into CSR programs of rainwater harvesting, making a commitment that we are going to generate as much water as we are using. There have been demonstrations, for example, against companies like Coke and Pepsi in India, where there are large parts of India where drinking water is not easily available. And these were companies that were targeted, saying that you're taking, water and converting it into these fizzy drinks and selling it. So there are many pressures. And, that is why it is part of the leadership that you require as a CEO is multi-stakeholder management, because there are the activists and they're not going to leave you either.
I like this point of multi-stakeholder management, managing with among various actors.
And coming from different interests, so if I'm an environmental activist, I don't care about the difficulty you have in running your business. I'm only concerned about what is happening with the environment. And, other people, if I want the workers to form a union, I'm only looking at it from that point of view. But, if you are the CEO, you have to figure out a way of navigating this very complex landscape and doing what is right by everybody. And that requires great energy. It requires huge patience. It requires having the courage of your conviction. And it requires tenacity, and it requires the ability to stand in front of your shareholders and say, by the way, these are all the things that we are doing, so our results will not be as great. I must say, Paul Polman, when he joined Unilever, went on record and said that.
What did he say?
Oh, he said that, these are all the things that we are doing. We're going to stop giving our quarterly guidance. And, we'll still do what is right. We'll report everything that we're doing. And if you see the performance of Unilever for some time competitively was not as great, but in the end, people did reward Unilever for the tough calls they made. They took, as did Coke, commitments of saying that we are going to put 1 million women in business around the world through our vendor program.
Okay,
I know companies like Mars, for example, are working with women cocoa farmers in Africa on improving their productivity, improving their yield, and doing that. Bunge, which is another company I was associated with and was on the board of, did similar work on, what is it called, shea butter, which goes into cosmetics and so on, and where the farmers are largely women. So there are a number of commitments large companies have taken on the S part of the ESG as well.
Thank you, Vinita. Mauricio, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Vinita, for the presentation. It was super insightful, and the VUCA term, it's new for me, so I'm going to look it up a little bit more. I know we're on time almost, but I had a really small and straightforward question that is regarding the trade systems used in companies and businesses. Do you think that trade can be used like as an incentive or as a form to take down pressure on the cash financial system that it's like really intensive on cash and money? And I wanted to know and ask you if you've seen like examples in some companies that they use like trading systems, and if not, do you think it could possibly help us? And that comes from basically an experience I had in a community that I see that some small communities, like if you take the community and analyze it kind of as an economy, they really work on trade systems. So I'm really intrigued to see if those systems like operate on big businesses or they're just cash, like utilizing cash.
I'm not sure I follow the question. When you say trade systems, do you mean barter or do you just mean trade? Yeah, trade, like for services and products, like there is no cash,
associated to
Oh, you mean
the
to
transaction.
say, so the transaction is I give you a service, you give me a service, and that's the transaction.
Exactly. There's no money to it.
Oh, so there's no money to it. Personally, I have not seen it. And it's certainly, you know, this payment in kind where a service you provide, company A provides to company B and company B provides to company A gets cancelled. You know, certainly in large organizations, I have never seen it. And it's tough because, you know, large organizations have processes and systems, and if I'm buying something from you, there is a whole paperwork that is involved. Now the whole thing has got digitized. And therefore, the question really is, how do I value what I have got from you versus what I have provided to you as a company? So I think that that concept of, you know, no money exchanged for services rendered, I'm not familiar with.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I see there was two messages written in the chat box. One is from Bernadita. I don't know if Bernadita is still here.
Yes, I'm still. Good morning. And then, sorry, I have really bad connection. I say this many times, but unfortunately there is not a power electricity here. So my apologies about it. No, the comment is just in general, because I think it's wonderful to have these sessions, and thank you very much actually. And but for me it's mainly about it's like the professor mentioned it, to increase we need to have accountability, all right, from the producers, the users, the governments, everyone, right? But the thing for me is being so realistic about what we can do in the short term or mid-term, right? Is like I think we need to have approaches more holistics, right? Like for example, if we think a solution for reusable, for example, products or any other solution that we can have in mind, is like we need to understand how we could be affecting other sectors too, part of the principles at the end, right? So I think it's mainly about it, right? It's like for me, and I'm saying this because I'm participating in many sessions and many master class talking about these topics, right? But for me, the point is like sometimes we are too much in focus or putting a lot of attention to we need to reduce, we need to go to zero. Yes, it's correct, but let's not forget, especially in regions like Latin America, or I don't know if the same for India or Africa, there are many people depending of these subproducts, right? So, and if we take these employees from them, for example, is that we could be increasing the poverty index in our countries, right? So I'm not saying that it's not okay to do it. For sure, it's okay. We have to, right? It's necessary for the planet. But I think it's, for me, like we need to think in holistic, right? Like putting everything together and trying to get the best approach and solution.
No, I completely agree with you. You have to think holistic, but it's a tough one because even in terms of thinking holistic, there's a bit of a give and take. So right now, for example, in India, we rely a lot on thermal energy. And, you know, India has resisted the pressure because there is so much of employment that the coal industry generates. So let's say we stop generating thermal energy, we end up creating huge unemployment. And, you know, how do you balance the two? So these are real dilemmas, and therefore require you know, a roadmap, because you don't get to switching from coal to solar 100% in one go. You can't, because there are livelihoods involved, there are people involved, there are processes and systems involved. But I do think that there is a very compelling case for all of us as people who are consumers, employees, leaders of companies or NGOs or academic institutions, You know, the case is very compelling that the behavior of people has to change.
The behavior of people has to change. Thank
Yeah.
you, Vinita. Rocio, I think the last one. Rocio, you have your hand up. And I'll bring the comment of Chris Biner. It's written in the chat box here. Rocio?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Vinita. Congratulations for this conference. I have the curious, because this is my first time to listen the business with the relationship of the earth charger. I have a question. What is your opinion, Vinita, about the sustainable development, education with the relationship of the business? Because it's very interesting. Use the companies with ecologists. What is your opinion in this case, Vinita?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. Opinion
Sí.
in this case about? There's some disturbance at the back.
Yeah,
Could
there is
you-
a bad sound. Rocío, si quieres hablar en español, yo traduzco, pero no se
could
escucha bien.
could I request you to just quickly repeat your question?
No me escuchan bien, mucho ruido atrás.
Can you repeat your question?
Okay, let me to answer this moment. So sorry.
Okay,
Now?
in the
Okay, I'm here. Okay, I repeat again the question. What is your opinion about the relationship of the sustainable development education with the business? What do you think, Vinita?
It's education. It's about education for sustainable development in the business world.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, you know, Rocio, the companies have no choice but to educate themselves, because there are, as I mentioned, there are 2 or 3 things that are happening. One is there is mandates and regulation on reporting. Now, you know, is everything going to be fine just because you're reporting? But I think reporting causes you to to do something differently, because you have to report on it and you can't just not do anything and report on it. So it's a good way. It's a good way to start, in my view. If people are not doing it voluntarily, then mandating something and then putting in place checks and measures to see, and over a period of time, you know, that the metrics are bound to improve if there are questions being asked, like we've got you know, audits happening on so many financial transactions. So I think that is the second thing, which I don't think anybody needs to convince anybody, is that, you know, when businesses close down, because suddenly there is flooding in a city, or there is a typhoon where you don't expect that to happen, or something completely crazy happens. So, you know, I live in Bangalore. We had about 2 or 3 months ago unusual rain, but in parts of Bangalore, people had to be evacuated from their homes on boats. Now, we've seen flash floods happen in Germany. We've seen people die of heat wave in Canada. We've seen all kinds of unusual activity. And I think it's very clear, as far as business is concerned, that these are business risks. Now imagine having your entire data center or your entire cloud housed in a city which just gets rained away because there is a flash flood. And you know, that's not happened before. So increasingly, what you're seeing in the risk assessment of companies is, you know, geographic location. What has been the history of that geographic location? So I do think that the time to be an ostrich with your head in the sand is over, because it's just all around us. You know, unseasonal rain, climate change, all of those things are happening. And, you know, businesses are increasingly asking the question or being asked the question in terms of how you're mitigating some of these risks.
Thank you for answering my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so with this, we are about to close. I will just give you the floor, Benita, for your final comments or conclusion, but I want to also actually thank Rocio for this question, because we often do not think that business officials or those working in the private sector, either business leaders, need some education about education for sustainability, ethics in leadership, how the impact of the work of businesses in the social or environmental dimensions of societies. So it seems that there is a vacuum on people are going through MBAs, but not necessarily prepared to look at a larger role of business, this expanded role of businesses. I think there seems to be a vacuum. So first, I would like to thank you, Benita, for sharing with us today from your experience in so many years working with big companies. I myself learned about VUCA world, which is this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity in the world. So I thank you for that. And Chris Biner wrote in the chat box about accountability. Accountability as a critical competence to teach business leaders. And I would just, at least from my part, would like to end with this highlight. And now I'll give you the floor, Benita, for your any final conclusions or reflections you would like to share with us before we close.
No, it's been wonderful. I think your questions have been, very incisive. Obviously, when a question gets asked, you think about those things differently. I just want to end by saying thank you very much, Miriam, for giving me the opportunity to share. I would also say that I don't think any of us has the answer, but all of us have some part of the answer. And I think it is only through more dialogue, greater empathy, better understanding of issues that a dialogue can be reached, and being less selfish, because I think this is one of those things where you can't say, I've got to get everything, let the compromise be made by someone else. So it's a tough one because it calls for sharing the wonderful resources this planet has given us in very many different ways. I think the question from Rocio and what you said, Miriam, at the end is also very important because, we have to learn new subjects just as we learn new skills. And some of the things that are really not even taught specifically in MBA schools are, what is the new quality of leadership that leaders need? There was a time, when leaders were all about being directive, being decisive, now you can be directive and decisive when the questions are very simple. If you think about problems, there are problems where the problem is known, but the solution is also known. Then there is a problem where the problem is known, you don't know the solution, but you know somewhere the solution exists. But take the COVID-19. When it came, we took a long time to figure out what the problem was. Then we took some more time to figure out what the solution was. So, there are known problems, there are knowable problems, and then there are unknowables. And I think that's what the VUCA world really talks about. And we have to go back to our academic disciplines and say, how well are we preparing people, not just in terms of functional leadership, but in terms of adaptive leadership, in terms of other leadership competencies that have really to do with what I think one of my slides mentioned, greater empathy, greater understanding, more holistic thinking about things comprehensively, not just linearly. Diversity is something that many people talk about, but diversity is tough. You have to be very confident to have a conversation that takes into account divergent views before you can converge. But most important, you have to come in with the intent that all of us here want to be part of the solution. None of us know the solution, but we all want to be participants in finding the solution. I think unless the mindset changes, unless the approach changes from one which is, I can only win if you lose a little bit, to, either we all win or we all lose. Because I think those are the stakes.
Either we all win or we lose. Well,
Or
thank you
we
so
all
much.
lose. The timing would be different, but we will all lose. Nothing's going to happen to the planet. We'll just slowly disappear.
Good. Thank you so much, Vinita, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Many thanks.
At the end of next month, within a month from now in April, we will have our third masterclass of 2013. All of you are invited to join us. Thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you very
Appreciate.
much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.